So keep working, with the debate team to tell you that we're bringing in pretty good people. Give them your undivided attention, please.
Okay. Good morning. I'd like to thank Christy for inviting me to go with. And so today, the talk I'm going to give is about the fundamentals of economic reasoning, with a little bit of particular focus on how to think about economic reasoning when it comes to looking at questions of policy and debate. So basically, the lecture is going to have a set of 3 parts. The first is going to be sort of economics as a worldview. How to think about the world as an economist, what economists see is going on in society, and what that means for how to analyze the way that society works when people come in and try to change particular parts of it, try to engage economic policy. The second thing then is going to end up being sort of how economists understand that worldview in terms of a particular analysis. So this is going to be where we're going to do market supply, market demand, and then market equilibrium. And these are sort of the fundamental concepts. Okay, I'll write down on it. That govern how economists see the world as functioning, and then everything else becomes a question of how can we understand this in terms that relate to the basics of supply, demand, and their corresponding equilibrium. So that's the overall analysis, sort of these 2 parts, and then the third part is going to be sort of what does this mean for looking at policy, very briefly, and then questions. So the first thing is economics sort of as a worldview, as a vision of society. So people who get into social science, who care about the way that the world works, sort of always come in, I think, with at least some initial idea of what's going on in the universe, right? How is it that human society is ordered? And for economics, or economists especially as they're trained, one of the fundamental insights that leads to the economic point of view is that society is a fantastically complicated, and in fact, almost unfathomably complicated system in which there is very little central direction. Now that claim might surprise a lot of people who think of sort of, especially in the context of civil liberties, the state being very much in control of what's going on. States and individuals and governments are the primary thing you learn about in history. So, right, what happens in France in the 18th century is dictated by the kings, by the revolution, by Napoleon. But if you think about the underlying business of everyday life and not the political history of those eras, economists see that fundamentally every individual is pretty much in control of what they're doing, and that the system that they produce is fantastically complex. Just think about nowadays the production of even a basic consumer good that each of us look at or purchase. Think about food. Think about going into the grocery store. There's a bajillion things in the grocery store. They all get to your grocery store and not any other. They're all produced somewhere. They're all manufactured possibly in various different places. They end up in about the right quantities at about the prices that people want to pay for them. And yet there's no central person in the government who's in charge with your grocery store, or even to a very large extent with grocery stores in general, with food production in general. There's some of that, but not nearly as much as you think to make sure that the whole system for billions of people and trillions of goods works out properly. So this sort of view, where if you think about that part of the system, it seems like there's lots going on that nobody is planning centrally, nobody is directing it. But individuals seem to be able to coordinate to produce fantastically complicated objects in fantastically complicated societies. This has led economists to think about what mechanisms exist in society that coordinate behavior in this way without somebody coming in and saying, you make Nutri-Grain bars and send them to these stores in these quantities, right? No one is ordering Nutri-Grain to produce Nutri-Grain bars, and yet they do. And this system ends up being the market. And this is one of the most famous initial expositions of something in 1776 when Adam Smith publishes The Wealth of Nations. And he points out that the market system channels people as if by an invisible hand to act for the benefit of all society by producing these goods and services, even though when we orient ourselves to ask for those goods and services from individuals, we're asking not out of their benevolence to society, but out of their self-interest. Right? I'll pay you. So you can get something you want if you give me something that I want. So that sort of economics is a worldview, and it leads economists to understand behavior in a particular way. So the ideas of the economic theory of behavior, right, so economic man, as he's sometimes called, are very, very thin, really. The first is that people act. People are actually consciously able to pick directions they want to go in, and to the most part, act on them to the best of their ability. People act, and they act towards goals, but they do so under a condition of scarcity. Scarcity is just the fundamental idea that no matter what you want, you're giving something up to get it, because the stuff, time, resources, right, money, just physical products in the ground is finite. There's only so much of it there. There's only so much of it there now compared to, say, what you could get 10 years from now. So scarcity means that people acting to get what they want are constrained actors. They're acting under a condition where they have to choose between various things that they want in order to get the most of what they can get, right? So to be here right now, you're all giving up some other opportunity you could be doing with your Wednesday morning. But presumably, hopefully, you'll think that this was the best way to spend 2 hours that you could have spent 2 hours on. So this is the idea that under scarcity, people acting do what's called constrained optimization. That is that to the best of their ability, given what they want, which we're taking as outside of this analysis, they're going to get the most of what they want that they can for a given set of constraints, for a given amount of time, for a given amount of money, right, for a given level of technology. And one of the reasons they're going to do this is because they're interested in acting in their own self-interest, which is not to mean selfishness, but instead just means that basically whatever it is that they desire, which includes the welfare of their friends, their family, their society, that's what they're acting to gain. They're not acting to gain some other thing, but they have an idea of what's good, and they're going to go for that good. And because they're responding to their self-interest in a constrained manner, one of the fundamental things that leads us to be able to explain human behavior is understanding the system of incentives that society or that individuals offer people. Incentives matter. Right? If someone offers you a wage, that's an incentive to do something you might not prefer to do. If someone offers you a wage to go be a garbage man, it's going to matter how much the incentive is, how high the wage is, how many other things you can do with the income that you're given from that wage in order to actually want to take or not take that job. And so that, right, wages are an incentive, right? Prizes are the most obvious incentive in history. If I want someone to do something, I'll offer a prize for its completion, right? Reward, lost cat. Incentives matter. And that the other thing is that in this world of constrained optimization, one of the other things that's constrained is information. So information matters. We're certainly all quite cognitively limited, not that we're stupid or irrational, but that we don't know everything, even about our own situations all of the time, right? I couldn't tell you lots of things that would seem to be economically relevant to maximize if I had perfect knowledge. But to the extent that I do have knowledge and how it's transmitted matters to understand how people behave. So this idea of people acting under scarcity and constrained optimization leads economists to come up with a particular model of how it is that that works inside the institutional context of a market. Right? So there's lots of times we're acting outside of markets, but the market is the fundamental unit that economists have analyzed since going back to Adam Smith. And this is actually why Adam Smith, I think, found the discipline, because before this, people are worried about how you should behave as a single seller or a single buyer, not how you should behave as a market, or maybe not how you should behave, but how you do behave in a market. So a market fundamentally, in the way economists understand it, is for some good. Let's call this good X. Pizza is my common example. And good X, there's some relationship for lots of different people between its price and its quantity. So down here we'll have some quantity of pizza over time, right? And up here we're going to have the price of pizza in some units, right? So this is price per slice. Yeah. So the price in dollars per slice. It's important to know, like, if this all of a sudden became a pie, the chart would change. But it doesn't really matter for this. So there's two sides to a market. The first side we're going to talk about is market demand. So demand fundamentally is the consumer side of the market, the side of the market that wants to purchase an object. And market demand is generated by each and every one of us. So if you think about the way that that works, is that at some price, you're willing to purchase, say, one slice of pizza. At a given time, maybe it's okay. Maybe this is, $8. So $8 a slice seems pretty steep, but probably somebody at some point, maybe if I kept talking until 4 or 5 p.m., would be willing to say, I'm really hungry. If I just force you to skip lunch, I'd actually pay $8 for a slice of pizza. But the second slice of pizza, you probably wouldn't nearly value as much. And so you might be willing to pay, say, $5 for that slice of pizza. So your second slice, but the price per slice you're willing to pay goes down, and so on. So the next unit of pizza, the marginal unit of pizza to you, may be only worth $3. And at some point, if I gave away the pizza, you probably still wouldn't eat infinite slices. So we're going to say maybe it comes, at zero price, maybe there's, you'll eat a whole pie if I just hand it to you, over a certain time period, but you're probably not going to eat 50. I couldn't eat 50. So this generates, if you think about you and the person next to you who's sort of a little different, and so on and so forth, a relationship for the entire society, for the people in question, which we're going to call a demand curve, to eat pizza. And so you can see that this relates the price at which pizza is offered to the quantity of pizza consumed. So this curve, for sort of the reasons I was stating before, but there are others as well that we can talk about if you're interested, is always going to be negatively inclined. That is, in general, it's one of the things that economists understand about the world, that the cost of an object, its price to the consumer, is going to have this sort of influence on the amount consumed. Right? So people consume very few diamonds relative to water. This isn't because necessarily that diamonds are diamonds happen to be scarce, their price has to be high, but it's not, right? We consume little water relative to diamonds, it would be because the price went up, right? It would not be necessarily any other question. So, people, right, high price of diamonds, low quantity, low price of water. Here, in this society, thankfully, high quantity consumed, right? If we all of a sudden went to an oasis in the desert, and the water was very scarce, you would probably economize on water even if you couldn't cut back to zero. So that's the demand side of the market, very briefly. The supply side of the market is fundamentally people who have an interest in producing and selling pizza. And so we can imagine these same people going through the same sort of decision calculus where they think about how much would I have to get in order to give away pizza that I have or to bake additional pizzas, right? If you're telling me that I'm not going to get any amount of money for doing the work of giving you the pizza, I may produce some just because I really like making pizza. It's physically enjoyable, but probably not very much. So at zero price, maybe have some quantity. But then, if it's going to be the case that I can get like $1 per slice, I produce some more. If I'm going to get $3 per slice, right, I might even produce more than that. If I'm going to get, $20 per slice, I might produce quite a bit more than that, right? It's, how much do I think I'm going to be able to obtain? And so here again, we're going to generate, just like we did by aggregating this across all of the individuals who wanted to purchase pizza, we're going to aggregate across all of the individuals who might conceivably be willing to sell pizza. And this is going to become a market supply curve. So, right, there doesn't have to be necessarily different people. It's quite possible that someone who is a net demander of pizza at some points would switch over to being a net supplier at other points. But as a whole, this is just a relationship, should be a little straighter than that we think is upward sloping. That is, that in general, if people say, we want more of this, we're willing to give up more of our resources to you for providing the good, then more of the good will be provided. Because those people acting to maximize their self-interest are going to be more interested in giving up that resource because they'll get more of something else. Right? At the point where I'm not getting anything to give away the pizza that I own, I might rather keep it and eat it. But if you're telling me I can get a whole car, at the limit for one slice of pizza, suddenly eating that pizza doesn't seem nearly as important. So the combination of these two factors of supply and demand leads to an idea of how it is that prices are formed and why they stay at a particular point. How it is that people are told, without anybody telling them, to produce some amount of pizza and charge some amount of price for it. So this is a concept called market equilibrium. And so it's very easy to find the market equilibrium with a supply and demand diagram. That's one of the reasons why economists love them. You just look at the intersection of supply and demand. So this price and this quantity is the equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. Now, to think about why it is that this is the equilibrium quantity, we should think about what happens if we're not at this point. So if we're not at this point, let's say that instead we've set the price of pizza somehow to be below the equilibrium price. So let's say this is the current price here. Now, at the current price here, let's look at the amounts that people want to produce and the amount that they want to consume. So at this price, the quantity demanded is down here, and the quantity supplied is over here. So this many people, this amount of slices of pizza will be produced by society, but society as a whole, once the pizza has been produced, will want to eat more slices than exist. Right? There'll be a shortage down here, this amount of shortage of pizza. So you go into the Papa John's and sort of like in those commercials when they have a big sale and then it sells out and everybody comes to the trucks. I think it's Domino's actually. People will want to buy a pizza that doesn't exist. And Papa John's will say, look, it doesn't make sense for us for lots of reasons to spend another unit of time, a unit of effort, a unit of pizza sauce making pizza because we're not getting compensated appropriately for that. So we're sorry, there's no more pizza to be had. So at that point, if you're a demander, you might have the clever idea that, look, let's say that where I am on the demand curve is say I'm this guy right there. I have a willingness to pay for a pizza slice at that price. And I'm currently not getting one. Well, if I just offer them a price that, a little bit above what's currently going, if I move the price up to here, maybe they'll sell me a piece, and because I've been willing to pay this price, I'm still saving a bunch of money. I'm still obtaining a surplus. So, in that way, there's pressure upwards on the price by individuals who are on the demand side to induce the suppliers in general, to produce more pizza. So we try to fix the shortage of pizza by offering people more to give up those resources. Because we're telling you, whatever you're using those resources for, we'd rather you use them on pizza as a market. Until you get to the equilibrium price. At the equilibrium price, anybody who doesn't have pizza who would like pizza says, at that price, it's not worth it for me to offer a higher price to obtain pizza. Right? I would buy more if it went down, but at the moment I'm happy. And no seller is thinking that he should be selling more or less because he's got it. Right? The ones who are up here think, at the price I'm currently getting, there's no point to me to produce more pizza, because it's not going to do anything. I'm not going to be better off. And you can think of the reverse process happening if you have a surplus. If they produce 500 pizzas and nobody comes because they're selling pizzas for $8 a slice, then they might think, if we sold pizza for $2 a slice, or $5 or wherever the equilibrium is, maybe people would actually show up. So you have sort of this moment where they realize we've produced some amount, and maybe we won't sell it all, but we'll sell more of it if we bring the price down to the point where we'd actually rather keep the pizza and sell it tomorrow than sell it for cheap today. So both sides of this market have powerfully an incentive to change the price to reach equilibrium, right? An incentive to do that. And because all they have to see is the price and observe their own sort of state of wants, they have the information needed to make that price change happen. So that's why, for a given demand and supply, that price is equilibrium. Because if you leave that price, if you go above or below, there's incentives and information in the market already to move you back towards the equilibrium price. So the other big thing that economists analyze isn't just what happens when you have an equilibrium, but what happens when these curves systematically change. And this is actually the part where economic analysis really comes in. Because once you understand that these curves exist in this sense and that they determine the equilibrium, how is it that we can make sense of what's going on in the world where we don't see prices stay the same all the time, quantities stay the same all the time. So one fundamental answer is that these supply and demand curves, since they represent people's beliefs and preferences, are not going to be stable, right? I would trust that probably nobody here has had stable preferences their whole life. I can think of many examples of my own where I used to eat things that I would no longer want to eat. I used to want, Transformers toys that make loud noises, and now I dread the day when my children have such toys, right? So my demand for those toys has changed. The best one for mine is cream cheese and jelly sandwiches. I ate cream cheese and jelly sandwiches every day as a school lunch from when I was in second grade until all the way through the end of third grade. And then one day I went to my mom and was like, I don't want these anymore. I haven't had one since. So the point is that these curves are not stable, and what can happen instead is that they can move. So one of the classic ways, right, is you can have increases and decreases in both. So if you look, you think what happens if everybody at all prices was willing to supply more of something. One way you can think of this happening is, let's say that the technology that produces it became cheaper. So all of a sudden, or maybe not all of a sudden, but over time, the supply curve shifts outwards. Now, we don't have this old supply curve, it doesn't exist. But what we do have is this new supply curve of pizza. Right? Maybe technology increased so that pizza ovens are more efficient. So I can produce more pizza with less time, and thus it's less costly for me to offer more units. Then what's going to happen is that we're going to establish a new equilibrium. So from here, we're going to move down to the point where this new curve intersects the demand curve, which we're assuming stays the same. Right? And so then the new price is lower, and the new quantity is higher. So supply increases are pretty awesome. And in fact, if you look at how economists think about human history and human, economic growth, it's a long history of supply being pushed ever outwards. Right? Technology has continually made it cheaper and cheaper to produce goods and services. We have to give up less, right? We don't have to have 90% of the people in society produce agriculture to feed everybody. We can have 3% of the people in society produce agriculture, and in fact, often then, the worry from farmers is they're going to overproduce, and then their price is going to go too low. And we can think of it analogously on the demand side, right? Let's say that, right, demand for pizza changes, demand for pizza increases. People like pizza more. Or, there's a million reasons why this could be the case. So then, right, you shift demand outwards. You get a new demand curve at which at all prices, in the aggregate, people are willing to consume, more pizza. So from there, we can see, let's imagine the supply curve is still this second one, that we're going to get a higher price as people are just willing to pay more. And because the price will increase, suppliers are going to supply more. So you get an increase in supply, but the price goes up. Right? So it may be that there's some time lag in the increase in supply, but that's sort of a secondary matter. The point is that when we get back to equilibrium after this change, the new reflection of the demands and supply of society will give you a new price that will be higher than the old price, but the quantity will be increased. This is fundamentally, we're willing to trade off other resources more for pizza. So that's sort of the basics of how the market system operates in an individual market without anything else going on. So let's look at a second what happens when some common things that happen in political life change the operations of the market. And the most common example of this that's easy to show on a graph is you have a wage or a price control. So let's imagine this isn't the market for pizza. This is the market for ice. So in the ice market, you have a normal demand and supply. Yes. Ice. Many people have ice makers in their freezer, but not everyone, and certainly there are times when your freezer is broken, or you're having a party, and so you have a demand for ice from the grocery store. And there's some supply of ice. So at any given time, you might expect that the ice market is in equilibrium. But then, if it's the south and it's the fall season, one of the classic things that happens is you have a hurricane. And when you have a hurricane, a lot of the supply of ice is threatened quite drastically, right? So power shuts off, ice production, right? Lines are down, people cannot ship necessarily into the place, and so you have a large decrease in the supply of ice for a short term, right? So this is the current ice supply hurricane. And at the same time, because people's power is out quite a bit, there are lots of people for whom there's a demand for ice that they previously didn't have, right? Maybe you were only using ice to cool your beer or your soda before a party, but now you need ice to have cold water, to keep your food cold, so your freezer doesn't spoil. So you have a movement outwards in the demand for ice as well. And so the magnitudes of this don't matter to tell the story, but let's say it's about that big. So now we have the hurricane demand for ice. Now, so what's going to happen in this market in the short term is if supply and demand work, we're going to have a new equilibrium price and quantity of ice about there, right? So we're selling less ice in total, about this much less, and the price shot up to here. Now, a lot of times what happens is that this is called, when one observes this phenomenon, by politicians or others even, price gouging. Because look, these people who are now demanding the ice, they're just got hit by a hurricane. And they really need the ice, right? They need the ice in ways that maybe the idea of this demand curve doesn't really make any sense for, right? They don't need the ice to put in their cooler to throw a party. They need the ice so that their food doesn't spoil, right? In very serious cases, they need the ice so that their insulin doesn't spoil, right? So you're talking about people with a very high willingness to pay for ice, right? These people really want ice at almost any price. And you have a supply that's been drastically curtailed, but why is it the case that these people who are really suffering now have to further suffer by paying this higher price? That's sort of the reason. And so a pretty common law that you'll have in states for disasters that are common is an anti-price gouging law, which functions as a ceiling. So you say no matter what you do, you can't charge, say, 30% over the disaster price, or the pre-disaster price. So this will be the price ceiling. Right, because the price is not allowed to rise above. But what happens when you impose this price ceiling is that now, if you look at the people's supply, they're only going to be willing to supply at the maximum price, right? The price can't be used to induce people to bring in additional supply or to give up more of what they already own. So you're only going to get this level of quantity supply. Whereas if you look at the demand at that price for ice, right, not only the people whose insulin is going to go bad or who have some other very serious reason to need ice, but just other people for whom it's very inconvenient to be without ice for several days when you're in North Carolina, where I was for 3 weeks. It was hot and miserable there. Hotter and miserable more than here. And they're just going to want ice. You have this quantity of demand at that price. The price is communicating to them that they can afford to, these people here can afford to give up whatever resources to obtain ice to make their life more convenient. Where if the parties up here, they decide, no, I don't need ice that bad. So this gap is a shortage. And in fact, you almost always do observe a huge shortage of ice right after a hurricane. And the question is how do we address that? So a price ceiling is generally about equity for the demand side. But one of the points that economists make about such laws is that what you're doing is you're harming the ability of the supply side to respond, right? People often who get arrested for these laws are stuff like, if you live in a place in the country that hasn't been hit by a hurricane, and you can rent a refrigerated truck, you can drive to North Carolina right after a hurricane and sell ice at this price if there's no law. And the reason you're doing that is precisely because you can obtain a price that makes it worth your time to rent a truck, drive halfway across the country with a bunch of ice in the back, and then be able to make it back. With, like that's something you value, and that those people in this circumstance are precluded from doing that out of concern for a certain level of equity, which is not an economic but a philosophical question, but the role of economists in policy is to point out you're making a trade-off here. You can't fundamentally get all of the people who want ice at the establishment level provided with ice by the market if you're going to impede the ability of the market to coordinate behavior. You can think of a similar thing in reverse for a minimum wage law. Right? A minimum wage law is going to create a surplus of people who want to work. Right? If you just imagine that we'll turn this into the market for wages. This is one of the other great things about supply and demand diagram. You can leave the price and quantity axis, erase the middle, and do something totally different. And it works quite well. So, we call this wages, right? Well, actually, technically, this is wages. Sorry. This is labor. A market for labor. Market for work. So, in this case, whereas normally the demand side of the market is people, is consumers, in this case, the demand side of the market is firms. It's businesses, right? Businesses want to hire people so that they can produce output, right? So they can do what, right? So they can get on with their business. And we, as individuals, are suppliers of labor, right? We have a certain amount of time in every day that we can spend working, and we're going to be willing to work more if you pay us more, right? I'm going to be willing to work another 20 hours as a research assistant if they double my salary. Actually, probably more than that. But so what you have in equilibrium is some amount or some market of wages, the equilibrium wage. And maybe this is a very simple market, but this is just a market for one particular type of labor. And some quantity of labor that is supplied, right? So let's say this isn't just labor in general, it would be too big, but grocery store baggers. So, right now, you look at this wage and you say this wage seems really low to me as an outside actor. And despite the fact that maybe I understand it was produced in this market, I think it's unfair. Or I have some other reason to believe that this is an inappropriate level of money for somebody to be paid for doing this job. So, at the political level, I institute a price floor. That is, I say, you cannot sell your labor for less than some quantity, for some amount, right? So this is the minimum wage. So now, instead of being bound to sell never above the limit, we're bound to sell never below this limit. And so what happens here is that at this minimum wage, here's your quantity demanded, here's how much firms are willing to pay, right? How many people firms want to hire at that wage? How much value those people are creating in the mind of the people who are running the firm when they're paying them this, right? Because if you're paying them an amount per day and they're not producing that much value for your firm, you're better off with them not working for you. And here's how many people are willing to sell their labor at that price. And so again, we have a shortage. We don't have a shortage in that there isn't too little supply to go around. We have a surplus. There's too much supply. There are too many people who want to work the minimum wage compared to too few jobs at the minimum wage that firms would actually be profitable for them to hire. And so this gap, if you think of it, is unemployment. A surplus of labor, what people are talking when we talk about unemployment. There are too many people who want to work and too few jobs for them to go to. So, while not necessarily always a very strong relationship, there's been some empirical work that says maybe not, and certainly a lot of places the minimum wage isn't binding, right? Imagine if the minimum wage is down here, people will get paid as if the minimum wage didn't exist. But in a universe, for a labor market where the minimum wage is binding, you're going to create some amount of unemployment. And this is, again, this is a trade-off. The trade-off between the people who get this wage, right, this group of suppliers, right, so they're getting all of this that they wouldn't get otherwise, versus the people who don't get this wage, right, who don't in some cases, don't get a job at all, right? So if you think about this down here, this is surplus. That is the difference between the price they were willing to pay and the price they got. That nobody gets at all, because none of this output is produced. And the bottom half of it is parts that workers who should have been employed if the minimum wage law didn't exist don't get. So those are some simple examples of, I think, the power of economic analysis in understanding what's going on in how a market system coordinates and what happens when you impede the coordination of the market system. But one last thing I'll talk about, and then we'll talk about questions, is this is the understanding the economists have of how a market system operates. But there's also work known in this field as public choice of an economic understanding that is constrained optimization of self-interested individuals in a government setting. And while that doesn't have as many clever graphs, I'll just go over it quite quickly in a second. And that is, so the same questions are going to get asked as they do about the market. What are the incentives of actors, and what information do they have? And so in the government, there's lots of different kinds of people. There's not the U.S. government. There's senators, there's representatives, there's bureaucrats, there's people who are doing all sorts of other things. There's lots of different individuals acting within the institutional framework of the U.S. government. So the most obvious one to look at is thinking about politicians as self-interested, not to say narrowly selfish, in that institutional setting. And the primary thing that they need to do to be able to further their self-interest is get reelected. And so re-election fundamentally amounts to, you have to convince the people who are voting for you that you are sufficiently valuable. And now what that means can depend, but often one of the ways that you show that you're sufficiently valuable is by bringing certain kinds of government benefits to your state. Because people in your state care a lot about things that are going on there, right? If you have a major military base, there's a lot of people who are voting on the idea that that military base is an important part of what it's like to live in your congressional district, in your state. And even though maybe that military base should be closed according to some broader social interest, it's not in your interest to be the senator from, Rhode Island who laid off 2,500 people in Rhode Island for some broader ephemeral goal. Right? And furthermore, there's other people who are going to point out that they really care about some little issue, right? So let's say that you are in a state with a lot of farming, which still exists despite the fact that 97% of the population doesn't farm. You have a really strong interest in current U.S. agricultural policy. And you're going to tell these people who you're voting for that, look, we don't care what you do on these other margins, but you're going to do what's best for us when it comes to farm policy, and we're going to vote for you. And so these people form an interest group. They have a group interest in making sure that the politician understands what it is that they want them to do, and because they get a lot of benefit. If you are a farmer, you get a lot of benefit from agricultural subsidies, from people paying you more than the market would for your crops. But if you're any individual in the rest of society, farm subsidies as compared to your total tax bill is maybe $5, $10 if you're very unlucky. So for you have to think about, is it worth $5 to $10 of my time to think about that particular thing that my senator or congressman is doing? And most of the time, people don't. People don't have any idea how their senators vote, because it doesn't make sense to think about all the different things that get voted on and pick out exactly how you want your senator to vote on each of them. And then have to go to an election and actually vote them out if you disagree might be more costly than any one issue for any one person. So you have the self-interest of politicians to get elected, right? Possibly not so they can seek rents, right? So that they can obtain sort of privileges from lobbyists, but because they want to do the most good. And it's hard for you to do a lot of good if you're not in office. And the interests of these small groups are to really care about the issue where it matters to them, and they're probably as apathetic about, say, military base closures as military people on military bases are apathetic about the Farm Bill. So these two sides can have sort of this problem where you have dispersed costs and very concentrated benefits. And so each individual issue, somebody benefits a lot, and everybody pays a little. So this is one of the reasons why public choice sees the constrained optimum of a politician as being not necessarily as desirable from a standpoint of overall social welfare as the constrained optimum in a market. And the other one is the logic of administration, so the logic of bureaucracy. So nobody ever really comes out in favor of bureaucracy, but of course it's one of the most important parts of a modern government. This is an idea that actually goes back to sociologist Max Weber. And the logic of a bureaucrat is if you're trying to do your job the best that you can, you are also constrained, and you're also self-interested, and you're also responding to incentives and information. And one of the things that works out in this way is that if you spend all of the money that you were assigned by Congress to do your job, and then you come back and say, I didn't get it done, I need more money, you often get it. Whereas if you came back and said, I found a way to do my job for half the cost you're currently paying me, you should lay off me and half the people in my department because we're too efficient, you get laid off. So even if it's the case that you had some idea on to fundamentally make whole departments not obsolete, but radically more efficient, in some ways the incentive structure you're given is to act as if that weren't true. To act as if you could do that without telling people, by the way, we're wasting, X million dollars doing this when we could do it some other way. Because for you, that means the end of your career, right? And the end of the careers of lots of your friends. Whereas it's very, easy to think about the world in a way where if you're doing it that well now, imagine what you could do if you just got X more million dollars, right? How much more could you save? How many, So the point is that the bureaucratic administration, who doesn't have this election pressure, has this similar pressure where they're a group, and the budget process is such that it rewards them for being expensive. It rewards them for doing a lot of things that are notable to politicians, so that politicians do well in the appropriations process by them, and not for really rewarding themselves for strong positions. So this very briefly is one of the set of economic understandings of government that lead many people in the public choice tradition who started looking at these questions to think that maybe the market system can be more efficient at doing certain kinds of things than government. So that's a very, very brief overview of what's a much more complicated literature. But that's going to be all that I'm talking about for now, and I very much welcome any questions on any of this. Thank you.
Let's do this. Let's take a 5-minute break and then come back to that. Okay? That way you can all kind of script away.
What is that sound? I bought Zed. Zed is so fun.
You bought Zed? I have Zed too.
No, don't.
I have Zed.
Zed? I bought Zed because I wanted to play some hard champion. You know how you see the League of Legends tournaments? How Zed does this crazy move and stuff like that.
Oh my god.